it's quite fun to have it on.
Shall I give the announcements right now? And yeah, so hello everyone. We have muted the audio for everybody, and we have also disabled the chat. So if you have any questions, kindly send them onto that WhatsApp group where you registered, and it will be forwarded to me. In case if somebody wants to join the talk, join the discussion, we will be live streaming the same on YouTube channel. So just in case if they are not able to get into the discussion, just direct them to the YouTube channel. Thank you.
Yeah, meeting. Yeah, कोई दिक्कत नहीं.
You can go ahead and start.
Okay. Hello and welcome everyone. I would like to thank all for taking time to join this conversation. My name is Dincy. I'm a PhD student at the Center for Wildlife Studies. CWS, Center for Wildlife Studies, is a conservation NGO with a legacy of 36 years doing science-based conservation research and training in India. We used to regularly host public talks related to ecology and conservation at our office in Bangalore. But with this COVID-19 locking us at our homes, we have taken our talks online. And this particular panel discussion is on wildlife tourism. And this is the third one in the Wildlife Chronicles series. We have had one on conservation in India and environmental conservation and environmental education, sorry. So today we have a very distinguished panel with a diverse set of expertise to talk about the prospects and challenges of wildlife tourism. And it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce the four panelists, Dr. Enrico Di Minin, Dr. G. Vishwanatha Reddy, Mr. Julian Matthews, and Dr. Krithi Karanth. Dr. Enrico Di Minin is an associate professor at the Department of Geosciences and Geography at the University of Helsinki, Finland. He is a conservation scientist with interdisciplinary interests ranging from economics to computer science. Dr. Di Minin's research work on tourism has been mostly focused on African and European PAs. Dr. G. Vishwanatha Reddy, IFS, is the Principal Chief Conservator of Forests, Head of Forest Force of the Rajasthan State Forest Department, and the Chairman of the Rajasthan State Wildlife Board. He joined Indian Forest Service in 1985. He has held several positions in the Forest Force, from Deputy Field Director of the Ranthambore Tiger Reserve to Principal Chief Conservator of Forests of Rajasthan. His work has helped in the protection and recovery of wildlife and wild spaces in India as well as in Indonesia. Mr. Julian Matthews is the founder and chairman of the Travel Operators for Tigers, popularly known as TOF Tigers. TOF Tigers is a collective trade initiative that partners with all stakeholders to advocate and support better tourism, nature tourism models for protecting wildlife and wild spaces across South Asia. And last, we have Dr. Krithi Karanth. She's a Chief Conservation Scientist at the Center for Wildlife Studies. She's also my PhD supervisor. Dr. Karanth's research in India, spanning 21 years, encompasses many issues in the human dimensions of wildlife conservation. And she has experience working on nature-based tourism for more than a decade. So I have sort of given a short introduction of all of you, and perhaps you can all say a little bit more about your work and your connection with tourism. We can start with Enrico.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, good afternoon in Helsinki, at least. I know it's good evening in India, and to whoever actually is connected to this panel discussion. Thank you very much for taking your time and being here with us. I would like to thank Dincy and Krithi for inviting me to this initiative. And as you already pointed out, I'm an associate professor at the University of Helsinki, where I lead the Helsinki Lab of Interdisciplinary Conservation Science, HELIX. And our work is very much interdisciplinary with expertise ranging from economics to computer sciences. And this is required in a world where conservation solutions are very challenging to be found because the underlying problems are so difficult and interdisciplinary. And that's why we are trying to address these issues with so many disciplines together. And I've been interested in wildlife tourism since the very beginning of my PhD, and that's because if we want to be achieving conservation in the real world, we have to be finding solutions that can support both biodiversity conservation and local people to live alongside. Thank you.
Julian?
Yeah, lovely to see everyone, and great privilege to be amongst this group. I feel very privileged. I'm not a doctor of science like everyone else, these distinguished gentlemen. I'm just a practitioner in nature tourism and travel around the globe. And I came to India and decided we needed to support them to find some other tools for conservation to save their tigers and landscape. So that's where I come from. Thank you.
Dr. Reddy?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I'm basically a forest officer, primarily working for protection and conservation issues. My association with wildlife conservation started with Ranthambore Tiger Reserve, where we worked extensively to protect the tigers first. And I have seen the beginning of tourism, which started with 50 to 60,000 visitors, which has gone up to 5 lakh visitors. The revenue also going from a mere $1,000 or $5,000 to now $4.5 million. And the total revenue, including the industry, has gone up to $300 million. It's a huge business in huge tourism in Ranthambore Tiger Reserve. And I also worked in Indonesia, working with the Lushar ecosystem. It's one of the largest surviving land patches with tigers, rhinos, elephants, and orangutans. I worked with Indonesian government to support them for promoting conservation through tourism. There are a lot of challenges associated with the tourism, which I have seen while working for these areas, and hope to share some of the ideas and also try to get some solutions for the local problems. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Krithi?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be part of this panel. These are all gentlemen whose work I admire very much, and I'm hoping we have a productive discussion. I have personally been interested in wildlife tourism for a decade now, particularly from an Indian context, where high densities of people live right next to many of our wildlife reserves. Trying to cope with conflict, land use change, and the myriad of challenges that we see around protected areas in India, tourism offers a real beacon of hope in terms of providing benefits to people and providing sustainable livelihoods. And the pandemic has literally come from nowhere and flattened tourism across the world. And I'm hoping we really get to have a productive discussion around how do we move tourism forward given this, and what are the long-term implications both for wildlife and people from tourism being completely halted or limping along today in many parts of the world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Krithi. In fact, one of the reasons that we decided to do this panel was because tourism is one of that sectors that was worstly impacted because of the pandemic, and thought it would be a good time to actually have dialogues between practitioners, conservation scientists about how do we move forward. So thanks for that round of introduction. And I would like to start by asking all of you one very general question. So tourism in wild places has many names and definitions. How would you define tourism? Krithi, perhaps you can start.
Oh, that's a tough one. To me, tourism is an opportunity and should be an equal opportunity for anybody to visit a place and see an animal, see a bird, see a plant, see a mountain with equal access. I think that's really, really important.
Okay, Enrico?
I've been thinking about this, quite carefully, and I think the most important aspect with wildlife tourism is when it refers to humans watching wildlife in their natural environment, because there are other forms of wildlife tourism, also called wildlife tourism, that also engage with interactions with animals, and I think those are inappropriate forms of wildlife tourism. So, in my opinion, it's about watching animals in the natural environment. But then, with time, and especially over the last 10, 20 years, conservation has become more aware of the importance of people. And that's why I think this definition of wildlife tourism has to be expanded to be, including the importance of delivering benefits to local people. And that's why probably my most appropriate definition of wildlife tourism right now would be that it's the responsible and sustainable travel to natural areas that conserve wildlife and helps improve the well-being of local people, which is also something which is more embedded into policy now, so that we combine both the conservation of biodiversity and human well-being in this definition. Thank you.
Okay, Julian?
He's just about said it. so no, I have an issue, and of course ecotourism is always sort of banded around as stuff. So I usually refer to as nature-based tourism. Tourism's got a really bad name, and to a great extent deserves it. And so, but in lots of places we talk about ecotourism. The reality is it's most places don't have ecotourism, because the reality is stakeholdership between the partners, the stakeholders of that landscape, those who run it, those who live by it, and those who visit it, is not a good one, and is not a relationship that needs to be done. So in terms of ecotourism, we should potentially stop using that or banding it around and call it wildlife-based tourism. Then we can start working on the real ecotourism going forward, because I think that's what we all need.
Dr. Reddy?
Yeah, actually, it's the toughest thing to define, but it's a pastime which people would like to visit some of the wilderness areas to revive their connections to the nature. That is that makes the difference with the tourism to the urban areas. Mostly people come not only to see birds, animals, but they also feel happy to be with the nature. That feeling is very essential. That is the key thing, that is the driver behind that particular activity.
Okay, I think I have a problem hearing all of you, so I'm just going to leave and come back quickly.
I'm going to continue the conversation because we're having some technical difficulties. I think the next question Dincy would have posed was going to be about how did we get interested and involved in tourism? So Enrico, can we start with you? What got you interested in this?
Sure, that will take me back a few years, and it's nice actually to be thinking about that. I guess since I started my studies in conservation biology, I've been particularly interested in the African context, where I've carried out most of my research, about how economic benefits derived from wildlife tourism can help offsetting the important cost of living with species that can be potentially dangerous for humans, such as tiger, lion, elephant. And an obvious way of doing this is actually, indeed, to be looking at non-consumptive forms of nature-based tourism, such as, wildlife tourism and ecotourism. And I've been particularly fascinated both in what works and doesn't work in relation to wildlife tourism supporting biodiversity conservation, but also at more specifically also on how we can make wildlife tourism more sustainable so that it's economically viable and can be providing support for local people. And since the PhD, since starting the PhD, I've established my own lab, and now the lab is actually pretty much involved still in looking at some of these questions. And we use, we started by looking at using survey data and carrying out surveys, which is one traditional way of also looking, at preferences of tourists for different species, on how these kind of like preferences differ. And now we're using data mined from social media platforms that have been posted from within national parks, from national areas, to actually understand what are the patterns, what are the preferences. So, it's something that, of course, has got a real world implication because wildlife tourism can help support communities, but also I think it can, we can understand better how tourists are motivated or what the preferences are in relation to natural areas such as protected areas.
Thank you. Julian, what would your response be?
To that question of what got me interested, of course, I was brought up in the wilds of Africa. We had wildlife all around our farm. I had it next door. My uncle brought up wildlife in his garden, in his park, in his house, in his whatever. So it was a wonderful experience. And that got me passionate, involved in it. When I came to the UK, I discovered that actually UK doesn't have any wildlife, particularly, nothing like I was used to. And then I got into nature tourism and set up my own business and started through having a nature tourism base, but I was determined it was conservation focused. So everything we did was responsible. And that was 25, 30 years ago now. So it was really cutting edge at the time. And then I came to India, and they had a problem with the tiger numbers at the time, 2004. And so I decided I could help potentially advise, get involved, work with the tourism industry to make it more sustainable, to change the structure, template of it. And that's what I've done ever since.
And then she's back. So.
Yeah, sorry, there was a technical glitch. I got logged out. So, I just want to ask a follow-up question to Julian. Is that what motivated you to start Top Tigers?
Well, it actually, the motivation was because I came here to look at setting up nature-based travel trips here. And what I was coming across was a very rigid structure that had no way of it was kind of Taj Mahal tourism in national parks, and I just didn't like that. I didn't feel it gave India enough scope to develop conservation. Tourism wasn't seen as a conservation tool like I had experienced it happening across the globe. So I decided to get together with my other travel competitors really, and set up a sort of alliance to help drive that forward and to help policy change and change the industry itself to make sure it was being more proactive. So that's kind of how I got involved.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Reddy, I have a question for you. So you have been working with the Forest Department for 35 years in different managerial roles. So in you said in Ranthambore that numbers have changed from 50 to 50,000 now. So in your view, how has tourism changed over these years? Perhaps you can give us some examples from Rajasthan.
Yeah, thank you. And I would like to add, how I got interested in this wildlife. Okay. I'm basically a trained wildlifer. My primary task is to protect the wildlife. They protect the protected areas. This was my main task when I took over the charge of Ranthambore Tiger Reserve. And I am a trained wildlifer from Wildlife Institute of India. The tourism was at a low level. There were not many vehicles. Maybe around 25 vehicles were there in the beginning. And that was the number of vehicles that were allowed. And there were no guides, no properly trained drivers. And there were very few hotels. One was Taj Hotel, which was the most luxurious hotel, and 2-3 hotels catering to the middle class families. Around, like I said, 50,000 to 60,000 was the number of visitors in 1997. But gradually we improved our protection levels. The visibility of tigers has gone up. The number of tigers, when I joined in 1997, it was estimated around 19 to 20. So gradually the number has increased up to 40, 45 by 2002. By 2002, the number of hotels have increased maybe to around 8 or 10 and 8 or 10. And the number of vehicles also we increased, and we trained guides. We have locally recruited the local guides and trained them. Who has trained? We only trained as forest officers. Whatever basics we knew, we had to do it. Just a second, please.
Yeah, I think I'll. Yeah.
Hello, sir. Sir, good evening, sir. I am in the web, sir.
We can't hear him.
Yeah, the number of gates were 20, 25. The number of vehicles also increased. The hotels increased. Now, the revenue, as on today, when I look at it, I was Chief Wildlife Warden from 2016 to 2019. Ranthambore was under my direct control. The number of tourists are more than, 3 lakhs of people, 300,000. It was huge. And money was the direct ticket revenue which we were collecting for the government was 4.5 million. It was uncontrollable. The number of vehicles have gone up to the limit to enter the park have gone up to 104. The area of the park remained same. The tourism has expanded from 300 to 400 or 450 square kilometers, but the number of vehicles have gone up from 25 to 125. But when people saw that number of vehicles are 125, the locals have brought more than 700 vehicles and then put at the disposal of the park to be used for the tourism purposes. Everybody sees it as an opportunity to make money and to make profit out of it. The local pressures are so high, number of tourist guides have gone up to 100 or 120. The 120 is the optimum number we can have it because 120 vehicles are going. So everybody would get one-day trip to the park. So the vehicles, 700 vehicles, the owners, they have become a force to reckon with. The guides, they are also as a group, they have become too big to be manipulated. And the hotel lobby, the number has increased the hotels enormously. The number of hotels have gone up.
120 when we did the research.
Yeah. So the number of people, the beds, the bed nights, they call it bed nights, available are more than 3,000 bed nights. So this is the situation which I have seen the growth. And Dr. Madhu Verma from Indian Institute of Forest Management has done a study, and she looked at the economic benefits of the tiger reserves. She estimated 450 crores is the net worth of the Ranthambore Tiger Reserve, which includes around 200 crores to all the sectors, including travel, airlines, hoteliers, hospitality, and everybody. And 1,000 families are directly dependent on the Ranthambore Tiger Reserve. One good aspect that I have seen in the years is when 1997, when I started my job as a wildlifer, always there was a resistance from the villagers, and their big question was, what is the benefit of this tiger reserve to the local people? That was a big question. That time when the tourism was very low, and I was not able to really tell a good answer to their question. But now, with 1,000 families directly dependent on the tourism, everybody is considering it as a big economic activity, because in Ranthambore, that Savai Madhopur district, Tiger Reserve is the only biggest employer. 1,000 people are dependent, direct families. Indirectly, 5,000 families are all dependent on it. So there is a biggest reason to justify that this area, which is locked as a conservation area, is generating so much employment to the local people without destroying the environment, apart from other benefits like biodiversity conservation. So now this is a showcase for the whole of the state government, and also to the people to tell what are the real benefits of conservation. So we are trying to promote this wildlife conservation as a profitable venture to the other areas also. These are all few changes which I have seen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reddy. My involvement in tourism now goes back over 10 years, and I came to it very much as a research scientist because there were some very interesting papers saying that in certain parts of the world, tourism was booming and there's been an explosion of wildlife tourism. And then there's in contradictory data coming in from other parts of the world saying that tourism was crashing and it was going to disappear in certain countries. So we started to look at that across India, and what I found, we did this massive research project in 10 of India's premier parks, and we found that yes, there was 15 to 20% growth rates of tourism, particularly around tiger reserves, not so much growth in tourism in non-tiger reserves. We found that local employment was low, with most locals being given seasonal jobs, whereas the higher paying jobs were still chefs and people being flown in from bigger cities in India. But also that tourism was slowly being priced out of people's hands. That earlier, in the 1980s and the 1990s, people could go to a particular park and the average Indian could afford to pay and visit a park. That's not true anymore. There are parks in India where tourism has become so expensive. The cost of a night stay, the cost of a vehicle entry is so expensive that it has become in some form elitist, because if you can't afford to go and you can't see these animals, then it becomes a very mixed bag. And I think that's something we need to discuss as well.
Okay, so I'm back. I'm facing some internet issues here. Sorry for that. So what are some of the challenges the tourism sector has been facing because of the pandemic? Enrico, can you shed some light on that?
Sure. Well, of course, the many conservation areas, and for the sake of those who are listening to us who might not be familiar with the word, because they're more familiar with the word protected area, basically conservation areas encompasses different forms of protected areas, including public protected areas, privately owned conservation areas, and community-owned conservation areas. So these conservation areas had to be closed during the crisis, the global COVID-19 pandemic crisis. And that was done, to prevent risks both to humans, but also in some cases for wildlife, like in the case of, I don't know, mountain gorillas in Rwanda, the Congo, and Uganda. And and then after these conservation areas were closed, of course, international borders were also closed, and the international travel also was shut down. So basically, the revenue, at least from international tourists, has stopped coming through. And these conservation areas depend on this revenue for supporting their daily activities. In terms of providing law enforcement, providing benefits to local communities, paying salaries of staff. And as you can imagine, one of the biggest challenges is indeed that in places where the income levels are already very low, such as in many African countries, and as Dr. Reddy and Krithi were also pointing out, in situations where human population density is extremely high on the fringes of these conservation areas, then without any income for your family or to be supporting your family, and with law enforcement also potentially taken down because of lack of salaries or because you have to be laying off personnel to cope with the crisis that might be affecting these conservation areas, then one risk is, of course, that people can potentially start illegally hunting animals. There can be an increase in poaching, and therefore, that other unsustainable activities could be starting. So that's actually one of the biggest challenges, that basically without funding, the operations have to be continued. And in situations where you have to be cutting down on personnel working on the reserves, then basically some of these systems can potentially become open systems that are more easily targeted by, for criminal activities. And so that's one of the biggest challenges. And then, of course, all the other activities related to, Dr. Reddy was pointing out about the number of vehicles involved in tourism operations, the buildings that have to be maintained. And if we look at the global south, where the climatic conditions are particularly harsh, then basically if you don't maintain buildings continuously or vehicles, then basically all of your capital which you've invested in this operation might be soon deteriorating if there's not continued investment. So the global pandemic is really like affecting the finances of reserves. And I think, I hope we're going to be discussing soon also what we should be doing in order to make conservation areas and protected areas in general more independent of this funding, should these situations occur more and more in the future, as it might likely be, because us as humans, we are interfering with nature more and more. And with the global wildlife trade, which is unregulated, some of these pandemics might be occurring every now and then. So I think the key principle here is, how do we address these challenges in the future? And I look forward to discussing these in the next questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I'll bring that up soon. Julian or Krithi, do you want to add anything, or do you have any opinion about it, the challenges?
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic is having a very significant effect on everybody across the globe, and I speak to a lot of my African colleagues and things as well. Huge ramifications there, because they don't only have government support, a lot of them are community conservancies and public-private partnership conservancies and that sort of stuff. So they're having huge effects. No one would have predicted the kind of pandemic situation that we have. And I've always said to some extent that India particularly is very lucky, because it's got its own domestic supply chain for nature-based tourism. And that's the best thing any country can have. It is the way to be sustainable, not relying on international. You have a local delivery. You make sure they're able to get to you when crisis, when political crisis, when security crisis, when pandemics come along. And who would have realized that a pandemic of this nature, it's a once in a generation. So it's not something we could have planned for, but it is something we're going to pay for. And sadly, wildlife conservation, the budgets for conservation are all going to be heavily hit. There's going to be, a big livelihood problem. But you know what? It'll come back eventually, and we'll get back on some level playing field. But we may have to change the system by which it works.
Yeah, I think to add to that, Julian, I think it's a fundamental difference that you point out that wildlife tourism in India, 80 to 90% in most parks, with exceptions like Ranthambore and a few others thrown in, is domestic tourism. So we have the ability to come back up much more quickly, regardless of whether airports open or not. And I think given the pressures that Dr. Reddy's talked about in terms of every year there's pressure to increase the number of people allowed in, every year there's pressure to increase the number of vehicles, the number of resorts and homestays being built continues to grow. And we have a unique opportunity of a pause button right now to figure out how do we set the caps, how do we monitor the caps. I do think eventually people will come back to the parks, because whether it's you or me or anyone else, there is a fundamental need for all of us to get out there and watch animals, and we're all going crazy cooped up. And this is the story for millions of people around the world. So I think it is, once people are sure that it's safe to come back, a lot of people will come back. And it's really now, how do you regulate it post that, which we've not done a very good job of in India. And I would like Dr. Reddy to actually add on to this, because that's been the challenge of how do you maintain the revenues, but at the same time, it doesn't balloon out of control.
Yeah, there are two things, Krithi. You told the parks have become very expensive. That is a fact. In some areas, in Ranthambore, it is very expensive. Even I cannot go as an individual. And at the same time, if we reduce the cost of it, how can we sustain the parks? How can we feed to the local economy? It's a real challenge. And how do we arrive at it? It's one thing which I sincerely think is biodiversity conservation. It's a ecosystem services which we are trying to preserve, which the government has to pay for the biodiversity part of it. So when the whole park is saving biodiversity, that biodiversity is meant for the public, is meant for the humanity. So which the society has to pay for the payment of ecosystem services. We are not asking them for money for like the Catskills in America, the watershed, water for the farmers and all. We are asking only for that, so that directly the government has to invest more, so that we are not dependent entirely on the tourism revenue for maintaining and for providing economical benefits to the local people. Unless we have this kind of policy change, it is not easy to sustain the same kind of revenues in the post-COVID scenario.
And I'm correct in thinking, if I am, Reddy G, that the actual budgets are being slashed at the moment for tiger reserves, particularly now have been and potentially will be. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, the budget is reduced by 25%.
Yeah, 25. I thought it was
Wow.
15. Whoa.
We are in the entire state of Rajasthan. Our budget is cut by 25%.
Wow.
Okay. So are you going to be able to make that up from some of the tourism revenue coming?
Actually, as per the act, whatever revenue we get it should come back to us. But government could not plow back that money also. So already the government has a lot of money, park money with them, which they are supposed to give. And because of this COVID situation, now we can't get the money also.
I'm sure.
Enrico, I'm just curious, because in India, we are certainly hearing reports of poaching going up around parks, right? Because people are being pushed further into poverty. Why pay for chicken in your local butcher shop when you can go back to hunting? Are you hearing of similar things happening in Africa because tourism is on hold, people's livelihoods are being lost, other job losses, and how do we address this from both private and public sector perspective?
Thank you, Krithi. And I think actually the best way of answering this question is actually to be saying that we don't fully know yet, in the sense that at the very beginning, there was speculation that the COVID-19 crisis would have actually triggered more poaching or illegal activities in national parks. And I'm sure that's the case in some of the poorest areas where people are, even when there was wildlife tourism, were not at all benefiting from it. And that's another problem with wildlife tourism in the African context, for instance, that it's very often international operators or tour companies who are based outside of the area who are mainly benefiting from the revenue. And I'm sure that in such cases, the illegal activities or people getting into the national parks simply for securing some food on the table for their families have increased. But I've also been hearing that in other contexts, which are more similar to India, such as South Africa, where there is a strong kind of like national component of tourists going to the national parks, and where the budgets for conservation have been quite important because all the revenue generated from Big Five tourism, to be clear with. So in some instances, like in the case of rhino poaching, probably this might not have been as a big issue because there were poachers who had been infiltrating the reserves, as normal tourists in their vehicles, and finding rhinos and then getting out of the vehicle, killing the rhino, and then going out. So I'm sure that in this extent, not having tourists in the national parks have been helping, law enforcers to be kind of like, focusing their efforts better. But ultimately, if we talk about commercial poaching, which is the biggest issue for some of the iconic species, such as elephant and rhino, then ultimately those operations, are being carried out regardless. So, there's going to be still instances where even if there's no international travel involved, the criminal syndicates will kill the elephant, will keep the ivory under safe conditions, or ship it under different means. So I think commercial poaching goes on unaffected by the crisis. But again, I think also we have to be very careful with always kind of pointing the finger against local people, because they are victims of the illegal trade in wildlife, and there's unfortunately what I call a reverse kind of like pressure in terms of income from the places where some of the products are being shipped to and used, Asia and the African context. So very wealthy conditions in Asia, and very high poverty levels in Africa that led these trade to be thriving. We need to be finding solutions that go beyond wildlife tourism if we want to make sure that local people benefit on the long term from conservation, so that we can also kind of like safeguard these places and these species on the long term. And I like Dr. Reddy's comment about payment for ecosystem services. I think if we can phrase it within the most recent intergovernmental platform for biodiversity and ecosystem services term, I think we should start focusing more on the terminology of nature's contributions to people, because I think that's where you're going to be making a big difference. Thank you.
Julian, your thoughts?
Oh, on Enrico, you mean, or on his thoughts?
On this balancing poaching and trade pressure as well.
Okay, I mean, I think a lot. I mean, I do think probably there is a lot of poaching happening and now going on in India, and certainly it's going to be happening a lot in Africa. We've got long issues going to be happening with people in that part of the world. But the problem is actually it's very difficult for any of us to know because none of us are being able to move around. So a lot of it's hearsay and stuff. So people are trying to do surveys. I think you probably are as well, aren't you, in terms of whether that poaching is happening. But I'm a big fan of nature-based tourism from a perspective of eyes and ears in the field as well. And of course, they not only come with eyes and ears of the visitors, which are not nearly as useful as the wildlife guides, who actually spend a lot of time in the wild and actually pick up stuff. And one of my major issues about what's presently happening in the Indian context is that we've been confined, actually, potentially tourists have been confined to a small area of tiger reserves. And in fact, if we could spread it further and thinner, and that's really the key, further and thinner, we could benefit a lot more people around the outsides, and you could effectively have a lot more eyes and ears in a greater environment. And that would be a way to reduce the kind of pressures. And of course, India, the potential for nature tourism is so huge and so immense and scary because of the numbers. So we actually need to get away from this containment that is presently happening, and is exactly what we tried to do, or the central courts tried to do 10 years ago. And in fact, all it's done is compacted it into a smaller area. In fact, we need to make it cross much more areas, many more zones, cover it, but thinner, make it a much thinner, less a dense kind of tourism factor, and maybe spread it to other villages and bordering communities in a way that gives them benefit too, not just the sort of hotspot stuff that happens at the moment.
Yeah, so we are sort of running out of time, and we have received like a lot of questions from the audience. So I'm just going to read out some of them. There are guides and drivers in each wildlife park, and presently they are suffering humongous losses. 3 months of monsoon will keep parks closed for even longer. Is there any organization or government has modeled to crest livelihoods for this strata of people during COVID crisis? Anyone?
Yeah, Rajasthan, we are trying to organize a few things. During monsoon period, we have the problem of grazing and protection. So we are offering the guides and some of the drivers to be engaged with the forest protection. When we engage local people, we have to pay them daily wages, which we are ready to pay them. It's a reasonably good amount. If not, it is like what they are getting through guides. At least they will get 70% of what they are getting. But this also involves them in the forest protection, park protection. And secondly, it gives them opportunity to be with the park and understand, so that when they come back during the tourism season, they can interpret better and tell a lot of stories to the tourists.
Okay.
Very much
another question. Sorry,
I was saying I very much approve of that. Use your naturalists and your guys, use them. They're really effective force if you can use them, and that's a great way to do is employ them in your protection services as that way. Good idea. We need to do it much more effectively.
So Julian, I have a question. So what are the different models that are being tried and tested to allow conservation to be supported without compromising through wildlife tourism?
Well, the reality is that there are lots and lots of fantastic examples happening. And I personally, because of my background and where I travel and where I sent my own clients, I'd seen lots of them. I'd seen them in places like the Pantanal in Brazil, where cattle ranchers had turned themselves over to nature tourism and worked. So I've seen that side of things, which is a kind of private conservancy stuff. I've seen community conservancies, as Enrico would have done in parts of Africa, where communities have got together and said, we want to restore our landscape, and we want some of those tourists. And those are generally on borders of protected areas, and they've come together and restored thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hectares with decreasing livestock levels and overgrazing and stuff. And that's a joy, a total and utter joy to see. And that happens quite quickly if you can get those communities to do that and to benefit from that. And India has that potential to do exactly that in its landscape. It's just a mental thing that has to get over how that can happen and how we can do it. And we might need some legislation, some sort of framework of a policy to allow that to happen. But those are really powerful ways, and those are tremendous frameworks. And to be honest, India's 20 years behind everyone else in this. There's enough expertise and experience and skills and investment in India to make that all happen. And there's enough templates around the world for us to adjust to the Indian model and the Indian landscape to allow that happen. So I hope that in the next 20 years that will happen. That's something we've been pushing for, something we're working with. You know, I've spoken to Reddy G about it countless times. So it is for the future.
Okay, thanks, Julian. So one other question: wildlife tourism remains inaccessible for a vast majority of people due to it being extremely expensive for lower income groups, including people who live alongside parks. If wildlife tourism has to achieve its secondary goals of awareness and education, how does the industry plan to accommodate this large group? Krithi, you have any thoughts? Enrico?
Well, you know, it's of course an important problem if you think that most of the children neighboring protected areas in Africa have never got to see a lion or an elephant, and how challenging that is if we have to be thinking that, you know, in 30, 40, 50 years time, we need to be making sure that this species is still there. And I think, you know, a lot of people think about wildlife tourism as a 5-star experience. And, you know, in many of the countries in Africa, that is the case. It's extremely expensive to get in. You need to go with a tour operator. You stay in a 5-star lodge where everything is being catered for. And I'm sure that also in the Indian context, that might be the case. But there's also other forms and, you know, of tourism in some African countries, such as South Africa, where basically this is a relatively cheap experience compared to other countries. And there's like different kinds of accommodation that cater for different kinds of tourists. So, you know, you've got all the range from backpackers to 5-star hotel, and, you know, within this kind of like offer, you can find your segment. You can go and drive the car by yourself, but that of course is a special condition of South Africa because of the conditions inside the national parks. So I think actually, but, you know, ultimately, if the question was for the people who live alongside the borders and, you know, who pay the costs and don't get to see these animals, or they only get to see or hear about them when there's a negative event happening, like, you know, in the case of a crop raiding elephant, a tiger killing some livestock, a lion killing livestock, then of course, that's also related to the fact that we need to be making sure that the people who live along the boundaries get to see face-to-face the animal in their, you know, in more normal conditions. And I'm aware, you know, of a number of projects where this is being carried out. And even if there's not a lot of research in this area, but from what, you know, some of my colleagues in Southern Africa have told me, this has resulted in, you know, enhanced understanding of the importance of conserving some places. So, you know, I think, you know, it's again a multifaceted approach to achieving this. On one side, you can cater for segments who can afford less. And on the other side, I think we need to be thinking how to be engaging better the people who cannot afford at all, right? And I don't know whether I should be discussing this now or later, but there's also increasing forms of, you know, digital safari experiences, especially under COVID-19, where a lot of reserves have been, you know, found themselves without any tourists, and they thought of, you know, having their guides and vehicles going out daily and, you know, showing to people around the world live, you know, the animals of Africa, and that's been extremely successful. Now, imagine if we could put a small fee on that experience for people who cannot afford it, to visit those areas, even to travel to those countries, will be reducing simultaneously the carbon emissions related to traveling to those countries, and at the same time, we probably would provide some people with an experience that they would not otherwise be able to afford. And I'm sure many of the people in the audience are familiar with these live videos on Facebook or Instagram. So just an idea there. Thank you.
Yeah. Krithi, would you like to add
I just want to add something. Tourism is very expensive, only few places. Like Ranthambore, everybody wants to go and see tigers quickly and go back. Everybody wants to go to only Ranthambore Tiger Reserve or Sariska. The all other parks in Rajasthan, there are 25.
Yeah.
The number of tourists visiting those places are minimal.
Yeah.
Maybe less than 200 or 300. Only few popular places, it is very expensive. So what we should be doing is, the economy, the revenue, whatever we are generating at those expensive places, it should be shared with the other parks. Like we have it in Madhya Pradesh.
Yeah, like Madhya Pradesh.
Madhya Pradesh, they have it. All the parks where whether tourists are going or not going, they will get the benefit to their parks because it is the wildlife of the state. Similar policy should happen in every state, so that we should have 2-3 places where we are getting more money, and that should supply to the less visited parks. That is one way. And secondly, we should also encourage people to visit other places and enjoy the wildlife in other places also, if they are very keen about nature visiting nature.
Yeah, okay.
So Reddy is absolutely right there in many ways. There's, I can't remember, 52 tiger reserves in India. We probably visit about 8 or 10, and the rest get ignored. And the reality is that the economics of tourism are working really well in those places, and they should be able to subsidize the ones that are not doing so well. And there are 700 sanctuaries in India, and you can go and spend amazing times in amazing places all by yourself, and half of those for very, very little money in India. So absolutely there is availability. But national parks should be available for all. They shouldn't be exclusive territories for any single side. And that's why I talk very much about having different formats of nature tourism in different areas. So maybe outside of tigers, where you can charge whatever you want, whether it be very little or very lot. And that's been very successful in saving parts of Africa. And also the format of tourism is really important, because we've got the kind of one size fits all format in India, which we need to have lots of different ways in which you can experience nature, walking, camping, and do a whole range. It's not nearly good enough yet to get all those different experiences. Just driving around in a Jeep ain't going to do the job, and we need to find ways of getting people on foot and out there and hiking and enjoying the wildlife in a wholly different way to make it really work, and to get the benefit, and to get more local jobs and more local people seeing it and all that sort of stuff. So it's a task. It's a task. But we're only at the very beginning of nature tourism in India, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, okay. So we are sort of running out of time. So I would like to ask one last question to all the panelists. So we have been talking about how the pandemic has been affecting tourism and how it has affected the economic stability. So moving forward, how do we rebuild tourism during these crisis times? How do we ensure economic stability? Enrico?
Yeah, thank you. I guess one option is what I mentioned earlier, that we become innovative and we start actually selling the products, on digital platforms, and we have people experience, nature in, via online videos, live videos, cameras being set in specific places, and that seems to be very popular. At least I'm part of a few of these kind of like groups, and the number of people actually going live and following live some of the species is just actually amazing. And I'm sure it would work also within the Indian context. And, even at times where the tourism revenue comes in, with people visiting, this could be a way of addressing, reaching or overreaching carrying capacity within national parks that can only actually afford a certain number of tourists. So that, I think, would be a good idea of selling the product and not having too many people visiting those national parks. Since the times of my PhD, I've been thinking increasingly about what I would call conservation trust funds, where the conservation areas, the national parks and the stakeholders that are part of the management plan of the protected area get together in a trust, and resources are being invested sustainably in the interest of covering costs at times where there is no wildlife tourism revenue coming through. And there will be a board of trustees which is trusted by everyone, and the money would only be invested in a sustainable manner. Because I think one important means is to be making sure that there is money in the wallet when we need it. And in times like this have demonstrated how I think also the budgets of the conservation authorities have to be flexible to accommodate for moments where there's going to be reduced income from wildlife tourism. But also I think, and this is actually the end of my comment here, is that we need to be thinking about multiple sources of income at the same time and not only depend on wildlife tourism. So we could have, for instance, in some countries now, these cash transfer from international NGO or donors to local people to prevent forest cover loss is working. There was a recent study in Indonesia where they demonstrated how this has actually helped reducing by 30% forest cover loss. We have to be thinking also about, as I was saying, nature's contributions to people and how to be making sure that people really realize what are the connections that their livelihoods have on nature, and that the governments are also very well aware of this, because that's another problem. We have to be thinking about philanthropy and public-private partnerships to mobilize more funding that could be channeled especially to areas which are 100% dependent on wildlife tourism. There has to be enhanced government support. In many countries, the fact that funders have been putting money for a very long term has been an excuse also on not investing directly in nature conservation. And as we depend on nature, particularly as this global pandemic crisis is demonstrating 100%, that our governments should be making sure that there are resources for protecting nature, so that those contributions will prevent future kind of like pandemics and help with tackling climate change too. So basically, we do have some mechanisms, and I'm sure there's going to be even more available out there. We need to start thinking smarter, because otherwise, the consequences would be that we're going to have more habitat loss and transformation in the future, and more of these pandemics coming through. Thank you.
Krithi?
I think fundamentally there's two things. One is the way tourism has worked in India for a long time is heavy dependence on government managed areas. And while those continue to provide important sources of income and access to amazing species like tigers, we really need to look into large scale expansion of tourism, either private or community owned. There are enough successful models around the world, both in Africa and South America. So we grow the estate and the land available and the people involved in tourism in India. It is not heavily dependent on 700 reserves managed by the government. And this also will hugely expand the number of people who can get involved in this. That I think as a all India level should be an ambition, because we need more space. A lot of wild, whether it be wolves or bustards or a lot of other species not found in protected areas, and that people would pay to go see. And we need to figure out how to expand these models of tourism. At the grassroots level, we as an organization have been working very closely with school children living around wildlife reserves across India. And ideally, my wish would be to take every child multiple times into a park. And this is something the government has done very well around certain parks in India. Take children to see animals, but getting them interested, getting them empathetic with programs like Wild Chalet is fundamental, because you need the people, not just the adults, but children living in these communities to care for wildlife. And they do get opportunities to see animals outside. So I think it needs several levels of effort, but I am very optimistic that a country like India will recover from the pandemic, at least on the tourism side, relatively quickly, because we're not dependent on international tourists, and we need to just put in these support systems in place and think of public-private partnerships, community partnerships to grow tourism in this country.
Thanks, Krithi. Julian, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, just endorsing what Krithi was just saying in terms of where nature tourism needs to go. We need to be looking outside of protected areas. We need to be looking at a whole different formats for tourism, not just vehicle-based, but the whole gamut of these areas. We need communities putting it together. We need the structures. We need a regulatory body, a much better one than we have, because there's very little monitoring going on. We need better land use planning beside all the protected areas and the other areas that could be brought back into the conservation world. So that is really those critical land use issues. The reason that Reddy G has to contend with the kind of massive expansion in tourism is because actually the land use planning alongside Ranthambore has just never been done. It's just a sort of default mechanism that anyone buys some land and builds on it. And so we know, and I've been there from the 2 lodges to the 120 lodges in my time in India, and I know they're kind of precious, but we need to extend the value of that tourism across many other areas surrounding that huge reserve, which extends way beyond Sawai Maripur. So, all those challenges are still got to come. We need ministries of tourism, particularly, to stop promoting destinations. They're now promoted by social media. You don't need promotion. What we now need to them is get them involved much more in regulation and destination sustainability. So they need to be putting in the regulations and applying that in different ways. So changing the way those departments work is a really important part of that whole process. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you, Julian. Dr. Reddy, any final thoughts?
Yeah, actually, this pandemic is created problem for parks where there was a heavy pressure on tourism, heavy pressure of tourism, like Ranthambore, Sariska, or Ghana. The other parks, of course, they were getting minimal. Now they will continue to get the same number of, because they were dependent only on the Indian tourists. This has given the opportunity to get rid of non-serious players like guides, non-serious guides, or the non-serious vehicle owners. They will see, and I think this is I consider this as a natural process where we are eliminating the unwanted people. And this should give an opportunity for all of us to think about how do we put a cap about the maximum number of tourists to a particular place. How can we develop the other parks equally so that it is promoted? But at the same time, how do we keep the people of that particular area, for example, Ranthambore Tiger Reserve, how do we engage the guides in these difficult times? The vehicle owners. Apart from that, there are hoteliers. They should be engaging people, and they should invite tourists, attract them for other activities, and some innovatively they should develop. Government can also promote awareness for the local school children in the whole district, subsidize them, allow them to come and visit, because this is the lean period. At the same time, the government can also promote a kind of economic activity, like the Indian government has announced 2 lakh crore inputs to the economy, into the economy. So if they can give some money to the tourism industry, to the nature-based tourism, probably that will sustain some of these activities.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Reddy. We have sort of crossed our time today, but I think it was a very enlightening discussion about tourism and how it has impacted us during this pandemic, and all those pointers about moving forward, how we can make better tourism models. I think it was really nice to hear from all of you. And I would like to personally thank all of you for being part of this panel discussion. And I would also like to thank all the audience for being part of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Nice to see you all.
Have a nice day.